Damascus has been liberated and the government of Bashar al-Assad has fallen. Syrians are celebrating the fall of a corrupt, repressive government. At least that's part of the story. Of course, no country is a monolith, and there are also Syrians, particularly from minority groups like Christians, Shias, and Druze, that are now fearful and fleeing their homes from sectarian insurgents replacing Assad. These Syrians have been purposely ignored and taken out of the media narrative on what's happening to the country. Because truthfully, how can we celebrate this moment when the victorious movement was led by Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, an offshoot of Al-Qaeda? The new head of state, Mohammed al-Jawlani, is the founder of Al-Qaeda in Syria and a former deputy to ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. To this day, the United States has a $100,000 bounty on his head. Jawlani and his militants committed grave crimes against humanity. This includes public beheadings, the destruction of religious sites, attacks against religious minorities and even Sunnis that opposed him, and the use of chemical weapons on civilians. HTS is directly armed by Ukraine, Turkey, the Gulf states, and by proxy the US. Jawlani and his group are still designated as terrorists by the US, United Nations, and European Union. Despite this, Western media have gone on to overdrive, whitewashing a terrorist group. CNN, for example, rebranded him as a blazer-wearing revolutionary who is fighting for freedom in Syria. They are trying to sell us another regime change operation under the guise of freedom, human rights, democracy, and overthrowing an evil dictator. This isn't the first time this has happened. When the West supported militants in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden was described as an anti-Soviet warrior fighting for peace. That's the same Al-Qaeda against whom the US supposedly launched its global war on terror, and is also the same Al-Qaeda that the US has been supporting for years. An internal email to Hillary Clinton, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan famously said that AQ is on our side in Syria. A big winner in all of this is Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu has been celebrating and even taking credit for Assad's fall, noting the IDF played a crucial role in decimating Syrian and Lebanese forces. The IDF have advanced towards Damascus and intend to annex a large chunk of Syrian territory. Jawlani, however, has no interest in defending Syria from Israel and has stated that he is ready to normalize relations with Tel Aviv and the West, and to keep fighting Hezbollah and Iran. Those are his real enemies, he says. And just last week, Turkey's Erdogan admitted to backing Jawlani and this militant advancement, referring to Aleppo as part of Turkey. Today, Turkey's flag flies in Aleppo side by side with Al-Qaeda. But if you point out much of what I have just presented, you are accused of supporting Assad or being an Assadist and standing on the side of oppression, further dividing movement for liberation. This McCarthyist smear is designed to dismiss legitimate criticism of the US-Israeli agenda in the region, an agenda that aims to crush all pro-Palestine resistance. While people have been distracted with debates about how bad Bashar al-Assad is, the real question has always been, do you support this Zionist land grab, or do you support the resistance to not only liberate Palestine, but the region from Western imperialism and capitalist interests? The longer-term ramifications of these new developments should concern anyone who cares about freeing Palestine and the region from Western colonialism and capitalist interests. To break through the fog of war, we must look at the imperial playbook and their agenda. In 2007, former US Army General Wesley Clark revealed the contents of a Pentagon memo from before the invasion of Iraq in 2003. It said that the US aimed to take out the governments of 7 countries within 5 years, starting with Iraq, and then Syria, and then Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran. The US saw their chance with the 2011 Arab Spring, pouncing upon anti-government protests, and alongside the UK, Turkey, and the Gulf monarchies, it began sending money and weapons to anti-Assad forces to hijack the movement and turn it into a regime change opportunity. Samantha Powers and the Obama administration sold this to the world as a humanitarian intervention to rid the people of a dictator. And yet, they recruited Al-Qaeda and the very forces they were supposedly fighting in Iraq to do the dirty work in Syria. Today, Syrian resources are constantly stolen from the occupied Golden Heights, where the US-based Genie Energy Company plunders Syrian oil. In the southeast, the US Al-Tanf military base violates Syria's sovereignty and uses its position to support sectarian militant groups and obstruct major supply routes between Syria, Lebanon, and Iran. And the US's support for Kurdish militants in the northeast of Syria has given it access to some of the most oil-rich parts of the country. As part of the strategy to upend the government, the US placed punishing sanctions on Syria under the Caesar Act. Sanctions and economic war are designed, according to the State Department, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow government. And that is exactly what happened. The Syrian economy collapsed, leading to poverty, destitution, local corruption, widespread hunger, and a massive refugee crisis. Regular Syrians couldn't buy a loaf of bread and access life-saving medicine due to sanctions. After years of economic crisis, more and more Syrians turned against the government, helping to usher in Assad's downfall. Millions of Syrians, of course, do have many genuine grievances against the government and are filled with hope at this time. It's only natural. Unfortunately, with rebranded Al-Qaeda at the helm of a new government, this transition will likely only benefit Israel, the United States, and NATO, weakening the anti-colonial struggle in the region and isolating resistance factions. Talking of Israel, what has Israel's role in all of this even been? They've treated injured Al-Qaeda fighters in field hospitals in the Golan Heights. They've paid salaries for multiple sectarian groups and supplied them with weapons. And they've also bombed Syria directly nearly every single week for the past 3 years, and at least 1,000 times in the past 5 years. Israel has been doing this not because Assad was a corrupt authoritarian dictator, but because Syria's role in opposing their imperial project in the Middle East, weapons, ammunition, and supplies to Lebanon have come through Syria for decades. In 1995, in his book, Fighting for Terrorism, Benjamin Netanyahu wrote that the biggest threat to Israel was Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran. Since Israel couldn't win a war if they fought against them directly, regime change would need to happen in Syria, Iran, and elsewhere in the Muslim world. Netanyahu's agenda became the blueprint for the neoconservative war planning to invade 7 countries after 9/11 that Wesley Clark told us about. Their plan has taken longer than expected, but it's never changed. In recent years, it seemed like this plan was failing, but now we see that efforts to target Syria, Lebanon, and Iran are back in full force, along with Somalia and Sudan. Syria's importance for the Lebanese and Palestinian resistance has been confirmed by the resistance itself. In 2023, former Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar said, "Syria under Assad represents one of the main pillars of the armies in the Levant. Therefore, those who are destabilizing Syria are ultimately not working in the interest of Syrians, nor for democracy or for human rights. They are working to cut the supply lines of the axis of resistance. The scale of deception and psychological warfare in this campaign has been off the charts. The same people who for over a year have told us about how the media lies about Gaza to manufacture consent for a genocide are now sharing and believing lies told by those very same outlets in removing Al-Qaeda when it comes to promoting regime change in Syria. And so now, not only have eyes been diverted away from the Gaza genocide, but people across the Palestinian liberation movement are divided once again on the issue of Syria, unable to see a long-term ramification of what's going to happen, of how these new developments are a huge setback for Palestine's liberation. Once again, Syrians have legitimate grievances against the fallen government. We acknowledge this and should be supported for their independent grassroots movement for fighting oppression. Understood. But we must ask ourselves many questions about this particular insurrection. Why, for instance, do these US, Turkish, and Israeli-backed proxies only appear when the Zionist occupation is at its weakest? Why do they only target the resistance and never the Zionist regime? Why has Syria been under continuous Israeli bombardment since October the 7th and even before it? Why are the same powers who become the so-called Syrian rebels also sign peace deals with Israel while pretending to care about Palestine? And most importantly, why do people keep falling for it even after they see the result of what happened in places like Libya or Iraq. If you want the Palestine liberation movement to succeed, then you have to resist psychological warfare and break through the fog of war. This is not about supporting or excusing Assad, but about understanding the imperial agenda. Syrians have a right to self-determination and liberation from oppression, but their efforts were hijacked and sold to the strongest and highest bidder. Syria was also pushed into a corner, having to defend itself from a foreign-backed insurgency. Any other country would have done the same thing. The goals of the war on Syria are clear. The US wants to destroy the resistance's supply lines, steal Syria's resources, balkanize the country, and create a state that normalizes relations with Israel. Those who think a new caliphate is coming to liberate Al-Quds will soon find out that the caliphate's goals fall neatly in line with the greater Israel plan. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. If you were duped, it's time to wise up.